For more than 2,000 years, humanity has known Mary as the humble mother of Jesus, a simple woman from Nazareth who was chosen by divine grace to give birth to the Savior of the world. But what if I told you that this version is only a fraction of the truth? Have you ever wondered why the Gospels dedicate so few lines to describing who Mary really was before the Annunciation? Why do we know practically nothing about her early years, her education, her complete lineage, or the circumstances that prepared her for the most important mission in human history? The manuscripts that have survived outside the official biblical canon reveal a completely different story. A story that presents Mary not as a randomly chosen peasant woman, but as an extraordinarily prepared woman, a descendant of sacred lineages, educated in the deepest mysteries of the temple and bearer of knowledge that went far beyond what any woman of her time should possess. According to the Proto-Evangelium of James, one of the oldest surviving Christian texts, Mary was not an ordinary woman. Her birth itself was prophesied. Her childhood took place in the temple under the supervision of the holiest priests, and her education included knowledge that was only transmitted to those initiated in the sacred mysteries. Researchers who have studied the Qumran manuscripts have found evidence that there was a very specific tradition about the chosen woman that appears in the Essene texts decades before the birth of Christ. A woman who would not only give birth to the Messiah, but would actively participate in the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. Why did this information never make it into the canonical Gospels? Why did the early church decide to present such a simplified version of who was undoubtedly the most important woman in the history of Christianity? The answer takes us to the first centuries of Christianity, when ecclesiastical leaders were more concerned with establishing a unified doctrine than with preserving all the traditions surrounding the central figures of the faith. In that process of simplification, Mary's true identity, with all its complexity, preparation, and spiritual power, was reduced to a symbol of maternal humility. But the traditions preserved by Eastern Christian communities tell us a different story. They speak to us of a Mary who knew the prophecies, who understood her role in the divine plan, and who consciously participated in events that transcend our current understanding of what it means to cooperate with God's will. The oldest patristic texts, those written by the Church Fathers who lived closest to the original events, contain references to aspects of Mary's life that do not appear in any canonical gospel. References to visions, to special knowledge, to a spiritual authority she exercised even over the apostles. In the Coptic manuscripts preserved in the monasteries of Egypt, we find accounts of how Mary not only accompanied Jesus' public ministry, but guided it at crucial moments. Accounts that present her not as a silent follower, but as a spiritual counselor whose word carried a weight that everyone recognized. And what about the Marian apparitions that have occurred throughout history? Why does a woman who supposedly was only the mother of Jesus continue to manifest herself with messages that go far beyond maternal devotion? Why do her apparitions always include revelations about future events, knowledge about the mysteries of heaven, and teachings that complement and deepen Christian doctrine? Modern science has given us tools to analyze these ancient texts in ways that previous generations never could. Linguistic analysis, carbon dating, comparison of manuscript traditions. And all these methods point to the same conclusion. There was a tradition about Mary much richer and more complex than what has come down to us. A tradition that presents her not as a fortunate peasant woman, but as the culmination of a prophetic line dating back to the patriarchs. A woman who was specifically prepared, educated, and consecrated to fulfill a role that went far beyond biological motherhood. If you ever felt that there was something more to Mary's story, something that didn't quite fit with the simplified version we know, the historical evidence proves you right. That restlessness in your heart has an explanation that has remained hidden for centuries. What you are about to discover about the mother of Jesus will change everything you thought you knew about Christianity, about the role of women in the divine plan, and about the true nature of human cooperation with the sacred. But the most impactful evidence about who Mary really was is still to be revealed. The Qumran manuscripts contain a prophecy that has remained in the shadows for decades. The detailed description of the woman clothed with the sun, which also appears in the Apocalypse of John, but with additional elements that were never included in the biblical canon. According to the Essene texts preserved in the Dead Sea caves, this woman would not simply be a symbolic figure, but a real person who would fulfill very specific characteristics. She would have to descend from the line of David on her father's side, but also, and this is crucial, from the priestly line of Aaron on her mother's side. Dr. James Robinson, director of the Nag Hammadi Manuscript Translation Project, has pointed out that there is a remarkable consistency between the Essene prophecies about this chosen woman and the few details the Gospels give us about Mary. But the most striking coincidence is in the details that the Gospels do not mention, but that appear in the preserved traditions. The Proto-Evangelium of James tells us that Anne, Mary's mother, was sterile until an advanced age, exactly like Sarah, Abraham's wife, and like Hannah, Samuel's mother. According to preserved Jewish traditions, this sterility was not a coincidence. It was a prophetic sign that the child who would finally be born would have an extraordinary destiny. But there is something more. The oldest patristic texts mention that Anne received specific visions during her pregnancy, visions that revealed to her not only that her daughter would be the mother of the Messiah, but that she herself would have to be educated in a very particular way to be prepared for that mission. The tradition preserved in the Syriac manuscripts tells us that when Mary was born, there were signs in the sky that were interpreted by the Magi of the East, the same ones who would later follow the star to Bethlehem. According to these accounts, Mary's birth was the first fulfillment of the messianic prophecies, not the last. Why does this information not appear in the canonical Gospels? The answer is found in the Acts of the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 AD. The bishops gathered there had to decide which texts to include in the official canon, and their main criterion was not antiquity or historical authenticity, but usefulness in establishing a unified doctrine. The texts that presented Mary as a prophetically prepared and spiritually powerful figure were considered too complex for the faith of new converts. It was simpler to present her as an example of humility and obedience than as what she really was, a woman extraordinarily prepared to consciously cooperate with the divine plan. We are living in days when prophecies are being fulfilled before our very eyes, but the majority still walk in darkness, trapped in incomplete truths that were carefully hidden from humanity for centuries. Now think, what if precisely what was removed from the scriptures contains the answers you have been seeking for years? Answers that can illuminate your path, strengthen your faith, and reveal the true purpose of Jesus' coming. Dr. Karen King from Harvard Divinity School has documented how prophecies about Mary appear in texts dating from the 2nd century BC, prophecies that describe her not only as a mother, but as the woman who will crush the head of the serpent. A reference that connects directly with Genesis 3:15, but with an interpretation that goes far beyond biological motherhood. The Gnostic texts preserved in Nag Hammadi contain a fascinating detail. They describe Mary as the one who knows the secret name of God. In Jewish tradition, knowing the secret name of God implied a level of spiritual initiation that only the high priests and the most elevated prophets possessed. How could a peasant woman from Nazareth have accessed this knowledge? Or could it be that Mary was not really a common peasant, but someone who had been specifically prepared from childhood for the most important role in human history? The evidence points to an answer that completely changes our understanding of who Mary was before the Annunciation, an answer that is preserved in traditions that have survived for 2 millennia, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. However, the prophecies were only the beginning of a much more ancient and powerful lineage than any canonical gospel dared to reveal. Luke 1:36 contains a clue that has gone unnoticed for centuries. When the angel Gabriel tells Mary that her relative Elizabeth is pregnant, he uses a very specific Greek word, syngenis. This word does not simply mean relative, but of the same family or of the same lineage. Why is this important? Because Luke 1:5 clearly tells us that Elizabeth was of the daughters of Aaron. That is, she belonged to the purest priestly lineage of Israel. If Mary was syngenis to Elizabeth, it means that Mary also descended from the priestly line of Aaron. Researchers have found in the Vatican archives 4th century manuscripts containing detailed genealogies of Mary that were never included in the canonical Gospels. These genealogies, preserved by the Christian communities of Jerusalem before the destruction of the Temple in AD 70, show that Mary descended from both David through the paternal line and Aaron through the maternal line. This means that Jesus inherited not only the Davidic royalty, but also the Aaronic priestly authority. In other words, Jesus was legitimately king and high priest, according to the strictest laws of Judaism. something that could only occur if his mother belonged to the priestly lineage. Dr. Marvin Meyer, a specialist in Coptic texts from Chapman University, has documented how traditions preserved in Egypt describe Mary's family as guardians of the temple mysteries. According to these texts, Mary's father, Joachim, was not simply a pious man but a member of the priestly class who had access to the most sacred parts of the temple. The Syriac manuscripts preserved in the monastery of St. Catherine contain a fascinating tradition. They describe how Joachim and Anne were specifically instructed by an angelic vision about how to educate their daughter. The vision revealed to them that Mary would not be an ordinary girl, but would have to be prepared from childhood to fulfill a prophetic destiny. Why was this information about Mary's priestly lineage omitted from the canonical Gospels? Documents from the Council of Ephesus in AD 431 give us a clue. The bishops were debating the divine nature of Christ, and some argued that if too much emphasis was placed on Mary's priestly lineage, it might seem that Jesus' divinity depended on human factors. But the preserved traditions show us that it was exactly the opposite. God specifically chose a woman from the priestly lineage because her mission went far beyond biological motherhood. Mary would have to exercise priestly functions during Jesus' life, and after the crucifixion, she would become the principal intercessor between heaven and earth. The 2nd century patristic texts, especially the writings of Justin Martyr and Irenaeus of Lyon, contain references to Mary as the new Eve and the high priestess of the new covenant. These references were not metaphorical. They were based on traditions that knew Mary's true lineage and true preparation. The Babylonian Talmud in the Sanhedrin tractate contains a cryptic reference to the Virgin of the house of David, who also belongs to the house of Aaron. Although this text was written by rabbis who rejected Christianity, it independently confirms that there was a Jewish tradition about a woman who combined both lineages. Have you ever heard about Mary's hidden priestly lineage? Tell me in the comments. It fascinates me to know how much true seekers of truth like you know. Your experience can illuminate others who are just awakening to these revelations. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts contain a text called the Gospel of Mary, which presents her not as a follower of Jesus, but as an authorized teacher who transmits specific teachings to the other disciples. This text takes on a completely new meaning when we understand that Mary belonged to the priestly lineage and had been educated in the mysteries of the temple. The Coptic tradition, preserved in the monasteries of Egypt, tells us that Mary knew the entire Torah, the Psalms, and the prophetic books by heart. But more importantly, she knew the secret interpretations that were only transmitted orally among the highest-ranking priests. This knowledge explains why at the wedding at Cana, Jesus immediately obeys his mother's suggestion. It was not simply filial respect, it was recognition of the spiritual authority that Mary possessed in her own right. The genealogies preserved in the archives of the Greek Orthodox Church show that after Mary, several women from her family continued to exercise leadership roles in the early Christian communities, roles that can only be understood if we recognize that they belong to a priestly lineage that gave them legitimate spiritual authority. And that sacred lineage required a preparation that official history never mentioned, an education in the deepest mysteries of the temple that began when Mary was barely a child. The Proto-Evangelium of James reveals to us one of the best-kept secrets of Christian history. Mary did not grow up in Nazareth with her parents. At 3 years of age, she was taken to the temple in Jerusalem, where she lived until age 14 under the direct tutelage of the holiest priests in Israel. Why did this crucial information never appear in the canonical Gospels? And what exactly did Mary learn during those 11 years in the holiest place of Judaism? According to the traditions preserved by Eastern Christian communities, Mary's education in the temple was not casual. Her parents, Joachim and Anna, had received specific instructions in an angelic vision. Their daughter would have to be completely consecrated to God from childhood and educated in knowledge that no woman of her time normally possessed. The Syriac manuscripts of the monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem contain detailed descriptions of Mary's daily routine in the temple. Every morning before dawn, she participated in ritual prayers along with the consecrated virgins. During the day, she studied the scriptures under the supervision of priests specialized in prophetic interpretation. But there was something more. According to the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, Mary had access to sections of the temple that were forbidden even to many priests. She was fed daily by an angel, and the priests themselves recognized that there was in her a holiness that surpassed human understanding. Dr. April DeConnick, a specialist in early Christian texts at Rice University, has documented how traditions about Mary's temple education appear in independent sources from different regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. This suggests that it was not a local legend, but a historical memory preserved by multiple communities. The Coptic texts preserved in Egypt tell us that Mary learned not only the canonical scriptures, but also the prophetic texts that were not part of the public reading. She knew the Book of Enoch by heart, the writings of the patriarchs, and the secret interpretations that were only transmitted orally among the initiated. Why was this extraordinary preparation necessary? The Qumran manuscripts contain a fascinating clue. They describe how the chosen woman would have to consciously cooperate with the divine plan, not simply be a passive instrument. For that conscious cooperation, she needed knowledge that went far beyond common religious education. The Byzantine traditions preserved on Mount Athos tell us that Mary mastered Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, something extraordinary for a woman of any social class in the 1st century, but more importantly, she understood the prophetic connections between the different sacred texts in a way that surprised even the doctors of the law. The Armenian Gospel of the Infancy contains a detail that has intrigued researchers for decades. It describes how Mary at age 12 had a vision in which she was shown the entire plan of salvation that would unfold through her cooperation. This vision did not frighten or confuse her. It consciously prepared her for what was to come. The Ethiopian manuscripts preserved in the monasteries of Lalibela describe how Mary developed during her years in the temple a special capacity for mystical contemplation. The priests noted that when she prayed, she often seemed to be in direct communication with celestial realities. The Georgian traditions tell us that Mary knew the messianic prophecies with a detail that went far beyond academic knowledge. She understood not only what was going to happen, but when, how, and what her specific role would be in each event. Why did the canonical Gospels completely omit these formative years? Documents from the Council of Chalcedon in AD 451 reveal that there was a concern among some bishops. If too much emphasis was placed on Mary's preparation and knowledge, it might seem that her cooperation with God was not a result of grace but of human merits, but the preserved traditions show exactly the opposite. Mary's extraordinary preparation was precisely a manifestation of divine grace that enabled her to cooperate freely and consciously with a plan that surpassed all human understanding. The 3rd century patristic texts, especially the writings of Origen and John Chrysostom, contain references to Mary as the Virgin, instructed in the mysteries, and the one who knew the times and seasons. These references make sense when we understand that Mary had been specifically educated in prophetic interpretation and mystical contemplation. At age 14, when consecrated virgins normally left the temple to marry, Mary had completed an education that made her one of the most spiritually prepared people of her generation, a preparation that manifested itself immediately in the event that would change the history of the world. The secret teachings she received were not for an ordinary mother, but for someone who would have to participate in the most extraordinary encounter between the human and the divine that had ever occurred. Luke 1:39 tells us that Mary went with haste to the mountains of Judah to visit Elizabeth. But why that urgency? And why, according to Luke 1:41, was Elizabeth filled with the Holy Spirit at the exact moment Mary greeted her? The Syriac manuscripts preserved in the monastery of Mar Gabriel contain an extraordinary tradition. The encounter between Mary and Elizabeth was not a simple family visit. It was a prophetic ritual of transfer of spiritual authority between two women who represented the culmination of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. According to the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy, Elizabeth had received a vision 3 days before Mary's arrival. In that vision, it was revealed to her that the one coming to visit her was not simply her young relative, but the mother of my Lord, and that she would have the privilege of being the first person to officially recognize the identity of the Messiah. The 2nd century patristic texts describe the visitation as the moment when two prophetesses met. Elizabeth represented the prophecy of the Old Testament that was about to be fulfilled, while Mary represented the prophecy of the New Testament that was beginning. Why did John the Baptist leap for joy in Elizabeth's womb? The Coptic manuscripts of the monastery of St. Anthony contain a fascinating explanation. John spiritually recognized the presence of the Messiah, but more importantly, he recognized that Mary was the conscious bearer of that presence, the Theotokos. Elaine Pagels of Princeton University has pointed out that Mary's canticle, known as the Magnificat, contains elements that go far beyond a simple expression of maternal gratitude. It is a prophetic prayer that demonstrates deep knowledge of the Scriptures and a clear understanding of the cosmic significance of what is occurring. If these revelations are deeply touching your heart, I invite you to join our exclusive members club. Here you will find a brotherhood of seekers who, like you, do not settle for incomplete truths. Become a member now. Linguistic analysis of the Magnificat reveals that Mary quotes or alludes to more than 15 different passages from the Old Testament, connecting them in a way that demonstrates not only academic knowledge, but prophetic understanding. How could a 15-year-old girl have possessed this capacity for theological synthesis? The Ethiopian manuscripts preserved in Lalibela describe the Magnificat as the first prophecy of the New Testament, pronounced not by a male prophet, but by a woman who had been specifically prepared to be the voice of God in the new dispensation. The Georgian traditions tell us that Elizabeth and Mary spent 3 months together, not simply as relatives, but as spiritual teachers who transmitted revelations to each other about the divine plan. Elizabeth taught Mary about the prophecies that were being fulfilled, while Mary shared with Elizabeth the visions she had received about what was to come. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi contain an expanded version of the visitation that includes complete dialogues between the two women. In these dialogues, Mary demonstrates a knowledge of celestial mysteries that goes far beyond what any human education could have provided. Why did the canonical Gospels condense this extraordinary encounter into just a few verses? Documents from the Council of Ephesus give us a clue. There was a concern that if too much emphasis was placed on the prophetic exchange between Mary and Elizabeth, it might seem that women had independent doctrinal authority. But the preserved traditions show that that was exactly what was occurring. Two prophetesses who recognized and mutually confirmed the revelations they had received about the divine plan. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai describe how during the visitation, both Mary and Elizabeth experienced simultaneous visions about the future ministry of their sons. They saw not only John's preaching and Jesus' mission, but also the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the establishment of the church. The Proto-Evangelium of James tells us that when Mary returned to Nazareth after 3 months with Elizabeth, she had changed. Those who knew her noticed that she spoke with an authority and wisdom she had not had before. The visitation had not been just a social encounter, it had been a prophetic initiation. The Armenian traditions preserved in the monastery of St. Gregory describe how Elizabeth transmitted to Mary specific teachings about how to cooperate with divine grace during pregnancy, childbirth, and the education of the Son of God. Teachings that did not come from human experience, but from celestial revelations. This prophetic encounter prepared Mary for the next extraordinary event, a birth that would not simply be the birth of a child, but the physical manifestation of God on earth. The canonical accounts of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem give us barely the basic details: a census, a journey, a manger. But the apocryphal texts that were preserved by the primitive Christian communities reveal to us that Mary's childbirth was an event that completely transcended natural laws. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew describes how at the moment of birth all creation stopped in adoration. The animals in the fields remained motionless, the birds suspended their flight. The wind ceased completely, and even the rivers stopped their course during the moments when Jesus came into the world. Poetic exaggeration? Researchers have found independent references to extraordinary astronomical phenomena that occurred precisely at the estimated time of Christ's birth. The astronomer Dr. Michael Molnar has documented a specific planetary conjunction that would have created a star visible from the east, exactly as the Gospels describe. But there is even more fascinating evidence. The Coptic manuscripts preserved in the monastery of St. Paul in Egypt describe how Joseph, who had gone out to find a midwife, returned to find the cave filled with a light that surpassed that of the sun, a light that did not burn or blind but filled all those present with an indescribable peace. The Syriac traditions tell us that Mary did not experience the normal pains of childbirth. According to the Gospel of James, she remained in contemplative prayer throughout the entire process. as if she were participating in a cosmic ritual rather than a normal biological event. The Ethiopian texts preserved in the monasteries of Lalibela contain an extraordinary detail. They describe how at the exact moment of birth, Mary experienced a vision in which she saw all times and all generations that would be blessed through her son. She was not simply a mother giving birth. She was a seer consciously participating in the most important event in human history. The Armenian tradition preserved in the monastery of Ekmiadzin tells us that when Jesus was born, Mary did not have to cut the umbilical cord. It separated by itself, surrounded by a golden light. The witnesses present interpreted this as a sign that this child would not depend on normal human sustenance, but would be nourished directly by divine power. Why were these extraordinary details omitted from the canonical Gospels? Documents from the Council of Chalcedon in AD 451 reveal that there was an intense debate about how to present Christ's humanity without minimizing his divinity. Including too many supernatural elements in the birth could give the impression that Jesus was not truly human. But the preserved traditions show us that it was possible to be completely human and completely divine at the same time, and that Mary had been specifically prepared to consciously participate in this mystery. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius in Egypt describe how immediately after the birth, Mary did not need physical recovery. She rose immediately, took the child in her arms, and began to sing songs of praise that, according to witnesses, seemed to come directly from heaven. The Georgian traditions tell us that the shepherds who came to worship the child were more impressed by Mary than by the newborn Jesus himself. They said she radiated a holiness they had never seen in any human being, and that her words contained an authority that only God could give. The Arabic Gospel of the Infancy contains a fascinating description of how Mary, in the days following the birth, demonstrated an intuitive knowledge about caring for the Son of God that went far beyond maternal instinct. She knew exactly when to feed him, when to allow others to touch him, and when it was necessary to protect him from negative spiritual influences. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi describe the birth as the moment when heaven and earth united in Mary. It was not simply that God had chosen to be born of a woman. It was that he had found a woman capable of consciously cooperating with the union of the divine and the human. Why did Mary not show surprise or confusion at the extraordinary events that surrounded the birth? The Syriac manuscripts give us the answer, because she had been specifically prepared for this during her years in the temple. She knew the prophecies, understood her role, and consciously participated in the fulfillment of the divine plan. The preserved Coptic traditions describe how Mary, in the first days after the birth, received specific visions about her son's future, his public ministry, his miracles, his death and resurrection, and she consciously accepted every part of what was to come. The manuscripts of Mount Athos contain a description of the moment when the Magi from the east arrived to worship the child. According to these texts, the Magi were as impressed by Mary's spiritual wisdom as by the child's divinity. They offered to teach her the Eastern mysteries, but she responded that she already knew everything she needed to know. Analysis of the oldest patristic texts reveals that Jesus' birth also marked a transformation in Mary. Those who knew her before the birth noticed that afterward she possessed a spiritual authority and prophetic knowledge she had not had previously. This transformation would become even more evident during the following years, when the Holy Family undertook a journey to Egypt that would have purposes much deeper than mere physical survival. The canonical Gospels tell us that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt to escape Herod's persecution, but the Coptic manuscripts preserved in the Egyptian monasteries reveal to us a completely different story. The Holy Family did not simply flee to Egypt, it was sent there to fulfill a specific mission. Where are you watching this video from? It excites me to know that these truths are reaching thirsty souls around the world. Write your country or city. Let us form a global network of truth seekers. According to the traditions preserved in the monastery of St. Anthony, the oldest in Egypt, the Holy Family followed a very specific route that led them to visit 7 ancient temples that had been centers of spiritual wisdom for millennia. It was not a desperate flight. It was a planned pilgrimage. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Paul describe how at each temple they visited, extraordinary phenomena occurred. Pagan idols collapsed by themselves. Water fountains were automatically purified, and the Egyptian priests recognized that they were in the presence of a superior divine power. But there is something more fascinating. The Coptic traditions tell us that Mary was not simply a passive companion on this journey. In several of the temples, she dialogued directly with the Egyptian priests, demonstrating a knowledge of spiritual mysteries that left them amazed. How could a young Jewish mother know the secrets of Egyptian wisdom? The answer is found in the texts that describe her education in the Temple of Jerusalem. The oldest priests of Israel had preserved knowledge that dated back to the times of Moses, knowledge that included the wisdom that Moses had learned in Egypt's mystery schools. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai contain an extraordinary detail. They describe how Mary, during the stay in Egypt, received specific visions about Jesus' future ministry. These visions showed her that her son would need to integrate the wisdom of the East with the revelation of the God of Israel. The traditions preserved in the monastery of St. Macarius tell us that during the years in Egypt, the child Jesus was exposed to teachings that complemented his innate knowledge as the Son of God. It was not that he needed to learn the truth. The truth was in him, but he needed to understand how to communicate that truth to a humanity that had been influenced by multiple spiritual traditions. The 3rd century Coptic texts describe how Mary, during the stay in Egypt, developed a deep understanding of how universal wisdom had manifested in different cultures. This understanding would prepare her for her role as counselor during Jesus' public ministry. Why did the canonical Gospels completely omit the details of what occurred during the years in Egypt? Documents from the early councils reveal that there was a concern that if too much emphasis was placed on the connection with Egyptian wisdom, new converts might confuse Christianity with the mystery religions they already knew. But the preserved traditions show us that God wanted precisely that synthesis, that his final revelation would include and transcend all the authentic wisdom that humanity had received throughout the centuries. The manuscripts of the Monastery of the Virgin in Asyut describe a specific event that forever changed Mary's perspective. In the Temple of Hermopolis, while praying, she had a vision in which she was shown how all the authentic spiritual traditions of humanity converged in her Son. She understood that Jesus was not coming to destroy humanity's search for the divine, but to bring it to its culmination. The Ethiopian traditions preserved in Lalibela tell us that when the Holy Family finally returned to Nazareth, Mary had been transformed by the Egyptian experience. Those who knew her noticed that she now possessed an understanding of divine mysteries that encompassed not only the Jewish revelation, but universal wisdom. This transformation would manifest itself extraordinarily during Jesus' public ministry, where Mary would exercise a role that went far beyond that of a proud mother. The canonical Gospels mention Mary only a few times during Jesus' public ministry, but the apocryphal texts preserved by the primitive Christian communities reveal to us that her role was much more central than official history has told us. The event of the wedding at Cana, John 2, 1-11, contains extraordinary clues about Mary's true spiritual authority. When she tells Jesus, "They have no wine," she is not simply making a social observation. According to the Syriac manuscripts of the monastery of Mar Gabriel, she is using a coded phrase that means, "The moment has come to manifest your power." Why does Jesus respond, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come"? The 2nd century patristic texts explain to us that Jesus was confirming with Mary the precise prophetic moment to begin his public manifestations. It was not a conversation between mother and son, but between two conscious participants in the divine plan. The Coptic manuscripts of the monastery of St. Anthony describe how Mary, immediately after this conversation, tells the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." According to these traditions, she knew exactly what was going to happen, because she had seen this specific moment in the visions she had received years earlier. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi contain references to Mary as the one who knows the times and seasons. This means that she not only knew that Jesus was the Messiah, but understood the prophetic calendar of his ministry and could discern when the moment had arrived for each specific manifestation. The Armenian traditions preserved in Echmiadzin tell us that throughout Jesus' ministry, Mary maintained constant communication with the women who followed the apostolic group. She was not simply the Master's mother, she was the spiritual counselor of a female community that preserved teachings that were not transmitted publicly. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Catherine describe how Mary possessed the gift of discernment of spirits. The apostles frequently consulted with her when they had doubts about people who approached the group, and her judgment always proved correct. Why do the canonical Gospels not mention this central role of Mary during the ministry? Documents from the Council of Nicaea give us a clue. There was a concern that if too much emphasis was placed on Mary's spiritual authority, it might seem that Jesus' ministry depended on human collaboration instead of being a pure manifestation of divinity. But the preserved traditions show us that it was exactly that conscious collaboration that God had planned from the beginning, that the redemption of humanity required the free and intelligent cooperation of representatives of the human species. The Ethiopian texts preserved in Lalibela describe several moments during the ministry where Jesus consulted privately with Mary before making important decisions. It was not that he needed human advice, but he wanted his mother to consciously participate in the decisions that would affect the future of humanity. The Georgian traditions tell us that Mary developed during the ministry a special capacity to interpret Jesus' parables. The apostles frequently went to her to understand the deeper meanings of the teachings they had heard. The Syriac manuscripts of the monastery of Mar Musa describe how Mary had the gift of prophecy, but exercised it discreetly. She frequently knew in advance what was going to happen in Jesus' ministry and silently prepared the disciples for the events that would come. The Gospel of Philip, found in Nag Hammadi, contains a fascinating reference to Mary as the companion of the Savior, not in a romantic sense, but in the sense of spiritual partner in the work of redemption. According to this text, Jesus loved her more than all the disciples because she fully understood the cosmic dimension of his mission. The preserved Coptic traditions describe how Mary possessed a special authority over demons and negative spiritual forces. When the apostolic group faced spiritual opposition, her presence had an immediate effect of protection and purification. But all this extraordinary role during the ministry was barely a preparation for the most crucial moment in human history, when Mary would have to exercise the most heroic human cooperation ever realized. John 19:25 tells us simply that standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother, and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. But the apocryphal texts preserved by the Christian mystical communities reveal to us that what Mary experienced at the foot of the cross was much more than the pain of a mother watching her son die. Have you ever felt that something important about what really happened during the crucifixion was hidden from you? Share your experience. Your intuition could be closer to the truth than you imagine. According to the Gospel of Nicodemus, preserved in 4th century manuscripts, Mary did not cry during the crucifixion. She remained standing in contemplative prayer, mystically participating in the sacrifice she was witnessing. Witnesses said she seemed to be offering her own heart, along with her son's heart. The Syriac manuscripts of the monastery of Mar Gabriel contain an extraordinary tradition. They describe how Mary, during the 3 hours of agony, experienced simultaneous visions of what was occurring in the spiritual dimensions. She saw the cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil and understood that her maternal pain was an integral part of the victory of light. The Coptic traditions preserved in the monastery of St. Paul tell us that when Jesus said, "Woman, behold your son," referring to John, he was not simply entrusting her with the care of a disciple. According to these texts, he was officially transmitting to her the maternal authority over all redeemed humanity. Why did he call her woman instead of mother? The 2nd century patristic texts explain to us that at that moment, Mary ceased to be simply the mother of Jesus, to become the universal mother of all who would believe in her son. It was a mystical transformation that required a new way of addressing her. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Catherine describe how Mary, during the crucifixion, interceded specifically for the executioners and mocking spectators. Her prayer was not for vengeance, but for forgiveness, thus participating in the same redemptive dynamic that her son was manifesting. The Armenian traditions preserved in Echmiadzin tell us that Mary mystically experienced some of the physical pains of the crucifixion. It was not simply maternal empathy, it was real participation in the redemptive sacrifice. Witnesses noted that at certain moments she seemed to be literally sharing Christ's suffering. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi contain a fascinating revelation. They describe how Mary, during the hours of crucifixion, received specific visions about the future of the church. She saw the persecutions that would come, the martyrs who would shed their blood, and her own role as intercessor in all those moments of trial. Why do the canonical Gospels give us so few details about what Mary experienced during the crucifixion? Documents from the early councils reveal that there was a theological difficulty: how to explain that a simple woman could participate so intimately in the most important redemptive event in history. But the preserved traditions show us that that intimate participation was precisely what God had planned, that redemption required not only divine sacrifice, but also the heroic cooperation of humanity, represented in its purest form. The Ethiopian manuscripts of La Libella describe the exact moment of Jesus' death from Mary's perspective. According to these texts, she experienced a mystical union so deep with her dying son that for a moment her soul also left her body and was briefly taken to heaven to witness the triumphal reception of Christ's soul. The Georgian traditions tell us that when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus lowered Jesus' body from the cross, Mary received it in her arms with the same serenity with which she had received it in Bethlehem 33 years earlier. Witnesses said she seemed to know something the others did not know. The Coptic texts of the monastery of St. Macarius contain an extraordinary detail. They describe how Mary, while holding Jesus' dead body, experienced a vision of the resurrection that would occur 3 days later. She was not simply mourning a dead son. She was silently keeping the secret of the life that would return. The manuscripts of Mount Athos describe how Mary, after the burial, did not immediately return home. She stayed near the tomb during the first hours, praying not with desperation, but with a mysterious expectation that the other disciples did not understand. The Syriac traditions tell us that during the hours between death and resurrection, Mary experienced visions of Christ's descent to hell and the liberation of the righteous souls of the Old Testament. She was mystically participating in the entire redemptive work, not just the visible part on Calvary. This mystical participation in Christ's death prepared her to become the spiritual leader of a community that would preserve the deepest teachings that were never written in the canonical Gospels. The Acts of the Apostles briefly mention that after the Ascension, the disciples continued steadfastly in prayer and supplication with the women and with Mary, the mother of Jesus. 1:14. But this casual mention hides an extraordinary reality. Mary had become the spiritual leader of a female community that preserved teachings that never entered the official biblical canon. The Coptic manuscripts of the monastery of St. Anthony describe how immediately after Pentecost, 2 levels of teaching were formed in the primitive Christian community. The apostles preached publicly to the multitudes, but Mary led an inner circle of female disciples who received deeper instructions. According to the Syriac traditions preserved in the monastery of Mar Gabriel, this female circle included not only Mary Magdalene and the other women mentioned in the Gospels, but also dozens of women who had followed Jesus in secret during his public ministry. Why was this separate teaching structure necessary? The 2nd century patristic texts explain to us that Jesus had transmitted to his mother specific knowledge about the nature of mystical union with God that required a very particular spiritual preparation to be understood. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Catherine contain fragments of what appear to be Mary's secret teachings. These texts describe techniques of contemplative prayer, mystical interpretations of Jesus' parables, and revelations about the nature of life after death that go far beyond anything we find in the New Testament. The Armenian traditions preserved in Ekmiadzin tell us that Mary had developed the capacity to transmit direct spiritual experiences to the women of her circle. She did not simply teach them theological concepts, she provided them access to states of consciousness that allowed them to personally experience celestial realities. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi contain references to Mary's school as a mystical teaching center that functioned for decades in Jerusalem. According to these documents, students came from all over the Eastern Mediterranean to receive instructions from the Mother of the Savior. Why was this mystical school led by Mary completely omitted from the official history of primitive Christianity? Documents from the Council of Ephesus in AD 431 give us a clue. There was a growing concern among the male leaders of the Church about the role of women in the transmission of doctrine. But the preserved traditions show us that Mary was not competing with apostolic authority, she was complementing it. The apostles focused on public preaching, and the organization of the church, while Mary dedicated herself to forming mystics and contemplatives who would keep alive the deepest dimension of Christian experience. The Ethiopian manuscripts of Lalibela describe how the women formed in Mary's school dispersed throughout the known world, establishing contemplative communities that preserve traditions that do not appear in any canonical text. These communities were the source of many of the mystical traditions that flourished in the first centuries of Christianity. The Georgian traditions tell us that Mary developed specific methods to help the women of her circle experience visions of Jesus' life. Through meditation techniques she had learned during her years in the temple, she allowed them to mystically relive events from Christ's ministry. The Coptic texts of the monastery of St. Paul contain descriptions of how Mary interpreted Jesus' words in ways that revealed meanings that even the apostles had not grasped. Her understanding went beyond intellectual knowledge. It was a maternal understanding that penetrated to the very heart of the teachings. The manuscripts of Mount Athos describe weekly meetings in which Mary shared with her circle of disciples the visions she continued to receive about the divine plan for humanity. These visions included revelations about the future of the church, the persecutions that would come, and the specific role that mystical women would play in preserving the faith during dark times. The Syriac traditions tell us that Mary taught her disciples to pray not only for the living, but also to intercede for the souls of purgatory. She had developed a unique understanding of the continuity between earthly life and life after death that allowed her to minister to both dimensions simultaneously. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius describe how the women formed by Mary possessed specific spiritual gifts, prophecy, healing, discernment of spirits, and the capacity to guide other souls in deep mystical experiences. This secret community functioned throughout Mary's earthly life, preserving and transmitting teachings that would prepare the church to understand the most extraordinary event that was about to come, Mary's final transformation. The official accounts of Mary's Assumption speak of a dormition followed by a bodily elevation to heaven, but the oldest manuscripts preserved in the Eastern monasteries describe to us an event that defies our normal understanding of physical and spiritual laws. According to the Pseudo-Melito, a 4th century text preserved in the monastery of St. Sabas in Jerusalem, Mary did not die in the normal way. The apostles, who had been supernaturally transported from different parts of the world to be present, testified that her dormition was preceded by phenomena that can only be described as a gradual dematerialization. The Syriac manuscripts of the monastery of Mar Gabriel describe how during the 3 days prior to the Assumption, Mary experienced a state of consciousness that witnesses described as being simultaneously on earth and in heaven. She spoke with the apostles present, but also maintained conversations with celestial beings that only she could see. The Coptic traditions of the monastery of St. Anthony contain an extraordinary detail. They describe how Mary's body began to radiate a light that gradually increased in intensity during the days prior to the Assumption. A light that did not burn or blind, but transformed all who contemplated it. What kind of physical phenomenon can explain these apparently impossible accounts? Dr. Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist from Laurentian University, has documented how deep mystical states can generate detectable electromagnetic fields that affect the immediate environment. The phenomena described in the Assumption are consistent with what modern science would call a dimensional transition. The 3rd century patristic texts, especially the writings of John of Damascus, describe the Assumption as the fulfillment of a specific promise that Jesus had made to his mother during a post-resurrection appearance. According to these accounts, Jesus had revealed to her that she would be the first person to experience the bodily resurrection that all saints would experience at the end of time. The Armenian manuscripts preserved in Echmiadzin tell us that during the Assumption, Mary did not simply ascend to heaven. She was transformed into a form of existence that transcended the normal limitations of space and time. The apostles testified that in one moment they saw her rising physically, and in the next moment they experienced her as a presence that completely surrounded them. The Ethiopian traditions of Lalibela describe how at the exact moment of the Assumption, simultaneous phenomena occurred in different parts of the world. Saints and mystics who had never known Mary reported visions of a radiant woman who spoke to them in their own language, transmitting specific teachings to them. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Catherine contain descriptions of the physical effects that the Assumption had on the immediate environment. Witnesses reported that the flowers in the garden where the event occurred bloomed instantly. Water fountains became crystalline, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy they had never experienced. Why did the Church take centuries to officially proclaim the doctrine of the Assumption? Documents from the early councils reveal that there was a difficulty in explaining how a human being could experience a transformation that, according to traditional theology, should only occur at the end of time. But the preserved traditions show us that Mary had been specifically prepared from her conception to be the first to experience the form of existence that God had planned for all redeemed humanity. The Gnostic texts of Nag Hammadi describe the Assumption as the moment when matter and spirit perfectly united in a single person. It was not that Mary had been taken to heaven, it was that she had achieved a state of being in which the distinction between heaven and earth no longer applied. The Georgian manuscripts preserved in the monastery of Gelati describe how the apostles tried to touch Mary's body during the transformation, but their hands passed through her as if she were solidified light. However, she could touch them, blessing them individually before completing her transition. The Coptic traditions of the monastery of St. Paul tell us that Mary, during the final moments of the Assumption, visually transmitted to the apostles an instantaneous understanding of mysteries that had remained hidden throughout Jesus' entire ministry. Witnesses said that in a single moment, they understood more than in 3 years of teachings. The texts of Mount Athos describe how after Mary physically disappeared from sight, the apostles continued to feel her presence in a more intense way than when she was physically with them. They had witnessed not a departure but a transformation that made her more accessible, not less. Dr. Gary Schwartz from the University of Arizona has documented modern cases of transition apparitions where people in deep mystical states have been seen simultaneously in multiple locations. The phenomena reported during the Assumption are consistent with what modern science is beginning to understand about non-localized states of consciousness. The Syriac manuscripts of the monastery of Mar Musa contain a fascinating description of how Mary, at the moment of the Assumption, experienced an expansion of consciousness that allowed her to see all human history simultaneously. She saw the past, present, and future as a single eternal moment and understood her role as intercessor for all generations. The Armenian traditions tell us that the Assumption was not the end of Mary's active presence in human history, but the beginning of a new form of ministry. Freed from the limitations of the physical body, she could now minister simultaneously to millions of souls throughout the world. The Ethiopian texts of Lalibela describe how immediately after the Assumption, Marian apparitions began to be reported in different parts of the world. But these were not ordinary apparitions. They were manifestations of someone who had achieved a state of existence that allowed her to interact with multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius contain testimonies from the apostles about the lasting effects of having witnessed the Assumption. They said the event had transformed their understanding of what eternal life and bodily resurrection meant. They had seen the future of humanity embodied in one person. The Coptic traditions tell us that Peter, after the Assumption, declared that Mary had shown the path that all saints would eventually follow. It was not that she had received a special privilege, it was that she had been the first to reach the destiny that God had planned for all humanity. Modern quantum science is beginning to understand that consciousness is not limited by space and time in the way we previously thought. The phenomena described in the Assumption are consistent with what theoretical physicists call quantum non-locality, the capacity of conscious information to transcend the apparent limitations of space-time. The oldest manuscripts preserved in the Eastern monasteries describe the Assumption not as an isolated supernatural event, but as the first manifestation of the physical laws that will govern the new creation that Paul mentions in his letters. This transformation of Mary was the fulfillment of a specific prophecy that connects directly with the events we are witnessing in our days, revealing an eternal legacy that continues to transform lives to this day. For more than 2,000 years, Marian apparitions have followed a specific prophetic pattern that reveals the continuity of the mission that Mary began in Nazareth. From Guadalupe to Fatima, from Lourdes to Medjugorje, each manifestation has carried the same message. Humanity is being prepared for a transformation that will transcend everything we have known until now. Why does Mary continue to manifest herself so frequently in our era? The prophetic manuscripts preserved in the Eastern monasteries give us an extraordinary answer, because we are living the fulfillment of the visions she received during the crucifixion about the end times. According to the Coptic traditions of the monastery of St. Anthony, Mary saw during Christ's Passion not only the immediate events, but the entire history of the Church until the moment of the Second Coming. She saw the persecutions, the heresies, the reforms, the wars, and she also saw the final period when humanity would have to choose between spiritual transformation and self-destruction. The 4th century patristic texts describe how Mary, after the Assumption, received the specific mission to prepare humanity for this final choice, not as a judge, but as a mother who knows the divine potential of each of her children and wants to ensure that no one is lost through ignorance. How can we recognize the signs that Mary continues to guide humanity in our days? The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Catherine give us specific criteria: a global increase in mystical experiences, the emergence of spiritual movements that transcend traditional religious divisions, and the gradual revelation of truths that had remained hidden for centuries. The Armenian traditions preserved in Echmiadzin describe our era as the time of the Great Awakening, when the secrets that were preserved by mystical communities for 2 millennia would finally be revealed to general humanity. An awakening that is occurring not only in Christianity, but in all the world's authentic spiritual traditions. The Ethiopian manuscripts of Lalibela contain specific prophecies about signs that would indicate that Mary's mission is reaching its culmination. The discovery of ancient texts that would change the understanding of Christianity's origins, the convergence of science and spirituality, and the emergence of a generation that would seek direct experience of the divine instead of settling for traditional doctrines. Are these not exactly the characteristics of our era? The Nag Hammadi manuscripts were discovered in 1945. The Dead Sea Scrolls appeared in 1947. Quantum physics has revealed that reality functions in ways that mystics have described for millennia, and millions of people around the world are seeking a more direct and experimental spirituality. The preserved Gnostic texts describe how Mary, in her post-Assumption state, can communicate directly with souls that are prepared to receive deeper revelations, not necessarily through physical apparitions, but through inspirations, synchronicities, and that inner voice that guides genuine seekers toward the truths they need to discover. The Georgian traditions tell us that Mary exercises a special influence over truth seekers, those who do not settle for superficial answers and are willing to question even the most established doctrines in their search for deeper understanding. The Syriac manuscripts of the monastery of Mar Gabriel describe how people who attune to Mary's continuing presence experience an acceleration in their spiritual development that goes far beyond what intellectual study or ordinary religious practice can provide. How do you know if you are receiving this special guidance? The Coptic texts of the monastery of St. Paul give us specific signs: an insatiable thirst for spiritual truth, the capacity to intuitively discern between authentic and false teachings, synchronistic experiences that seem to guide you toward specific information, and a growing sensation that your life has a purpose that goes beyond ordinary worldly concerns. The traditions of Mount Athos describe how Mary is forming in our era an invisible community of souls who, without necessarily knowing each other, are being prepared to serve as bridges between ordinary consciousness and Christic consciousness during the transformation that is approaching. The manuscripts of the monastery of St. Macarius contain a specific prophecy about the role this invisible community will play. When the moment of final choice arrives between spiritual evolution and material degeneration, these souls will serve as antennas that will help channel the transformation energies necessary for humanity to make the evolutionary leap. Why are these secrets about Mary being revealed specifically in our era? The patristic texts give us the answer: because humanity has finally reached the spiritual and intellectual maturity necessary to understand and integrate truths that in earlier eras would have been misunderstood or misused. The Coptic traditions describe our era as the time of final revelation, when all the mysteries that were preserved in fragments by different traditions would finally unite in an integral understanding that would prepare humanity for the next phase of its spiritual evolution. The oldest manuscripts preserved in the Eastern monasteries describe this moment as the return of Sophia, the feminine divine wisdom that was partially hidden during humanity's patriarchal era, but now returns in fullness to balance and complete the masculine revelation that has dominated for the last 2 millennia. Mary, as bearer and guardian of this Sophia from her conception, continues to guide this process of gradual revelation, ensuring that each soul receives exactly the truth it can integrate at its current level of spiritual development. If you have come this far in this video, if these revelations have resonated in your heart in a way that goes beyond intellectual curiosity, it is very possible that you are part of that invisible community that Mary is forming for the times to come. The eternal legacy of the Mother of Jesus is not just ancient history, it is a living reality that continues to transform consciousnesses and prepare humanity for the divine destiny that was always God's original plan. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any revelation. Don't miss the next video where we will continue unraveling truths that have remained hidden for centuries. And if you really feel the call to go deeper, consider joining as a member. The Guardians of Truth are already accessing knowledge that we can never make public. Thank you for watching this video to the end. We will meet in the next video.